So, continuing with the 8 verses, and we got to verse 4 last time. And the next 3 verses are very much connected with the central practice of the Lojong, the mind training, exchanging self for others. So I'll say a little bit about that first. And the meditation that we did at the end last week. I hope people didn't find that too strange and confusing. The giving and taking on the breath, taking someone else's suffering and then giving them your happiness, visualized with the breathing. That is the main meditation that is taught now in the Tibetan tradition in connection with this practice of exchanging self for others. But also, as I mentioned, probably it's fair to say the majority of the teachings in all of the mind training texts are about this one thing. It's the main practice is exchanging self for others. It comes, I think, possibly originally from Nagarjuna, actually, but the main kind of classic location for it is in the 8th chapter of Shantadeva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, the chapter on concentration. So, you can develop single-pointed concentration based on any object of meditation, but he chooses this meditation of exchanging self for others because this is the meditation that is taught in order to develop the mind of bodhicitta, the mind of enlightenment. So this mental factor, well, it's not a mental factor, it's a combination of 2 mental factors. But it is extremely important. It's possibly the most important mental quality to be developed in the entire spiritual path. Bodhicitta. Bodhi means awakening or enlightenment, and citta means mind. So it's translated as a mind of enlightenment. In various other translated in a lot of different ways as well. Awakened heart is another translation. Similar idea. And what it is the determination, the aspiration, the intention to become fully enlightened, to attain highest perfect enlightenment, the state of a Buddha, not for one's own benefit, but for the benefit of others. That's a definition. So this mental quality, we can call it, is the main cause of becoming a Buddha, a fully enlightened being. So this is more than just attaining nirvana. Nirvana is a state of peace, a state of complete freedom from suffering. But full enlightenment, by definition, means the highest possible development of all positive mental qualities. Okay, and that goes beyond just nirvana. So there's no reason, just purely from my own point of view, why I would want that. If I'm free from suffering, that's all I need for myself. So in order to become a fully enlightened being, a Buddha, you necessarily have to develop this mind that is primarily concerned with the welfare of others. So, as I say, most of the teachings in the mind training are focused on this. How do we, through progressive training, through developing a different mental habit to our usual one, how do we transform our habitual tendency to be primarily concerned with our own well-being and relatively indifferent to the sufferings of others, turn that around completely so that we are totally concerned with the well-being of others, whoever they may be, not just people whom we have a strong personal connection with, but anybody, any and every human being, any and every living being. Okay. So this term, Lojong, transforming the mind, refers to turning that self-concern around 180 degrees to a concern for others. That's the, as I say, it's one of the two main purposes of the mind training, but it's the one that is most emphasized. So as in all the Mahayana traditions of teaching, there is a balance between this, which is the method aspect. Okay, when we talk about method, we really mainly defer to the development of compassion, but also loving kindness, equanimity, and having an equal mind towards all sentient beings and so on. These sort of positive emotional moral qualities is the method side, and then the wisdom side, the insight, the understanding of the true nature of reality is the other side. And that is also covered in the mind training. But in the mind training tradition, the emphasis is on the method, is on the compassion. So the main practice is to develop pure compassion for all sentient beings, which is essentially no different from what I just said, turning round this mind that is primarily concerned with me, and am I all right, looking after number one, to being primarily focused on how's everyone else doing? How can I help this person? What can I do for you? So that attitude of self-concern, self-centeredness, self-cherishing is a habit that we've developed over innumerable lifetimes. And it's not, that's the case. Sort of, we're not like that through and through. We naturally have some compassion. We naturally have some degree of loving kindness, especially for certain particular beings. So we're not trying to develop some quality that is completely unknown to us. We're just trying to build on what we already have to reach its full potential. So at the moment we have moments of perhaps very pure loving kindness and compassion to some beings, and we simply want to develop that so that it's there all the time, whoever we're with. And we can see it in some of the lamas, I think, for myself, I see somebody like Lama Zopa, I think it just pours out of him. It's just there all the time, so you can feel it. So we can see that it's possible. And that's only through practice. It's not through some kind of magical, gift that they have that we can't access. It's just simply through day after day, setting the intention, the desire to develop this pure mind of concern for others and love and compassion. So we kind of need to be realistic about it. It's not going to happen overnight. So it can be very accepting of our own limitation at the moment. If kind of negative stuff comes up in our mind, well, that's very normal. That's how it is. The ego is going to be there for some time to come. It won't disappear overnight. But we can have faith that if we do these practices on a regular basis, it will slowly become less. And the pure qualities, the bodhisattva qualities, will become slowly more. So this meditation that we did last time, taking on the breath, is one way of practicing meditation on exchanging self and others. And it's the main meditation, I think, that's taught really in the Tibetan tradition now. It's slightly different from the one that is taught in Shantideva's text, and we will do that meditation as well, maybe a bit later on. So that meditation on exchanging self for others is one of the two main methods for developing bodhicitta, coming through, I think, originally from Nagarjuna and through Shantideva and other masters since then. And the other one comes from our Sangha, and again down through other Indian masters and Tibetan masters, which some of you may know. It's called the meditation of 6 causes and 1 effect. So this is meditating on all sentient beings as having been one's mother in a previous lifetime, and therefore by developing the sort of loving concern for them. The meditation of exchanging self for others is said to be more powerful, and it's taught for those of sharp faculties of high intelligence. But it's the kind of the heart and centre of the Lojong, the mind training tradition, is exchanging self for others. So the next 3 verses are very much about that. And there's verse 5. When others, out of jealousy, treat me badly with abuse, insults and the like, I shall accept their harsh words and offer the other the victory. This is a great one, isn't it? Now, these are not easy to do. And that's the whole point. That's why this text is so concise, because by kind of putting it right in front of us where we have the greatest difficulty in overcoming our self-cherishing tendencies, then if we work with that, if we practice with that, we can achieve some degree of success with a practice like that, then we make a lot of progress. It kind of almost covers everything else. So our kind of habitual self-cherishing mind says, this is crazy. If somebody does that, I've got to defend myself and tell them, you mustn't do that. And I'm justified in getting angry with them and so on. And what is the result? Does it actually solve the problem? Usually not, does it? Usually that person who's just insulted us and we insult them back, they don't say, I'm terribly sorry, it was a mistake, I didn't mean it. That's not usually what happens. Usually the situation gets worse. So our remedy is not working, So perhaps we could experiment with the suggestion that Geshe Langri Tangpa makes. Try it. If you can. Somebody says something that really upsets you, just stop for a moment. Okay, you're right. I'm sorry. See what happens. Because I'm not claiming that I do this on a very regular basis, but I have tried it, a few times, and the results are usually extraordinarily positive. Yeah. Anybody else got any experiences like that? Yeah? You're going to try it?
No, I said I've not tried it.
You've not tried it? Okay.
I think it works really well in traffic, in somebody...
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
They're expecting you to completely...
Yeah. And you give them a broad smile and a wave.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You can see the freaked out.
You can, yeah.
They don't understand. It doesn't compute.
It's okay with small things, isn't it? Like that.
Yeah.
That's fairly straightforward. It's the big things and the people closest to you maybe as well.
Very much so, isn't it? It's usually the close family member that is the most, the biggest reaction comes.
As well, I can have a strong reaction if somebody says something that hits a nerve.
Yes.
Makes us reflect on something about ourselves that we don't want to so it's good for that.
Yes. And so if we can bear that in mind, that's probably the reason why I've had such a strong reaction, is that there's something here that I could do with looking at that could give you pause for thought enough to think, I could be grateful to them then. Mm-hmm. Because if I need to look at it, they've taught me something very useful. If I look at it and think, this is something I need to change, and I do some work on it, I will benefit. And yes, Lindsay, right. We start with the small things, So there's this is not setting us a challenge to immediately try and do something that is beyond us, because sometimes these things we can't do it immediately. We can't sort of jump to being a bodhisattva. We can't. So we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves if somebody does something really really unpleasant and we react. That's going to happen, isn't it? Initially, it's going to happen.
Last day, is it the same as in last week when you said you can still deal with something, but when you were using anger as the example, you can still deal with something and correct something.
Of course.
Take action.
Yeah.
But without
that
mind, that negative mind. Yeah.
That's quite right. Richard asked a question about that, and it's interesting here. I mean, it's quite subtle because this one is rather more specifically saying to do the opposite of what we would normally do, isn't it? It is like, again, quite practically say, when somebody says something that they've insulted you, or they've said something quite negative, and say, "Oh, you're right. I'm sorry about that," which sounds a little bit opposite. Okay, let's stop and think about it because yes, sometimes we do need to take strong action if that is what is of benefit. Yeah. So the instruction isn't, we take strong action if we feel justified. The instruction is if it's going to be more beneficial to do that, thinking about the well-being of the other person. So it could be that there's a situation where we see that really it's not helpful to that other person to be indulgent with them and let them continue with that behaviour. So the point then is that internally we adopt the attitude that is in the verse. Internally we say, well, I'm going to think about whether there's any truth in that negative thing they've said about me, and also I can be grateful to them because even if there isn't, by giving me the opportunity to practice patience, they've done me a favour. At the same time, externally, if it's necessary and beneficial, we can, take a firm stand. But
I think
yeah.
most cases I can think of, people like treating me badly.
Yeah.
I think it will be also beneficial for them if I literally offer them victory.
Yeah. Oh yes.
Most
Absolutely.
of the cases I can think of.
Yeah. Very often that's true. Yeah. I mean, sometimes somebody does need a firm hand.
Yeah.
But I kind of wanted to elaborate on that because it's very easy to think oh, this is a situation where I need to be firm. I need to take a stand. We need to look at it. Why? Is that because you're trying to defend yourself, or is it really because you want to benefit the other person? That's the criterion. If it is about defending my dignity, do I need to do that? Not necessarily. Not always, So it's very easy to kind of fool ourselves into thinking that we're, kind of striking back with a good motivation when in fact it's not. Yes, Paul.
Yeah. When it says jealousy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the significance?
What's the significance with jealousy?
Well, I mean, it's not necessarily that it's always got to be a case of jealousy, but I think the example that I'm thinking of is if you, if you have developed some good qualities and you're starting to get respect from other people, it is almost inevitable that it will trigger jealousy from somebody who will probably say something, out of order. It's something, I don't know if you've come across it, but it is, a common reaction, a reason why people say sometimes, things that are quite inappropriate and negative, is out of this motivation of jealousy. Why is this person getting this respect when I should be getting it?
It's a bit like, it could be a group of people in a workplace or wherever else. And often you see it, the person who is generally kind and thoughtful sometimes ends up being the brunt of other people's frustrations, isn't it?
Yeah.
Whereas the people that actually can be quite difficult get away with a lot more in terms of... Is that where we...
Yeah, absolutely, Lindsay. Yeah. You often see that.
Yeah. See it all the time.
So that reaction of jealousy is one that is sometimes it's challenging to be compassionate about it, but it's very appropriate to be compassionate because it's a very, that person is having a very uncomfortable experience, and if they, instead of getting sort of a tit for tat reaction, they receive kindness and acceptance of what they're saying, it can turn it around completely. The workplace is always a good sort of laboratory for looking at these reactions that come. A workplace and the family, isn't it? So two of the main ones, absolutely. Yeah. So then, and I think, I don't know about this, but I think what Geshe Langrig Tangpa is doing here is he's ramping it up, It starts with, and I'll sort of look at others' good qualities and see them higher than myself, and then I will watch my mind at all times, and then I will kind of have a loving attitude towards somebody who's very negative. And then it's when somebody's actually doing something to me and insulting me, it's getting more sort of challenging, isn't it? And then the next one, when someone whom I have assisted and in whom I have placed great hope inflicts upon me extremely bad harm, I shall view that person as my supreme spiritual friend.
I'm trying to work on that now.
Are you? Yeah.
Because, well, it's somebody that I really love.
Okay.
And my thoughts are angry sometimes, resentful.
Yeah.
They're also loving and passionate and caring. And that's really difficult. And
so this is a person who's done something that's harmed you?
9-year relationships broke up.
Yeah.
And I'm working my way through it, processing.
Right. Yes.
And there's well, that's it. There's anger on my part, and upset and hurt. Because when I love with all I've got.
Right.
And I looked at this a lot today. And I felt really at ease with it.
Good.
Because reading it and thinking about it and changing.
Okay.
And noticing my thought pattern changing.
Excellent. Yeah.
But it's one out of the thing to get right all the time.
Oh yes, of course. Yeah. It takes a lot of work. So in a way, I think what you're saying, what you're pointing out to us, Richard, there is like in a situation like that, there's so much spiritual learning to be done, isn't there? The person is giving you a huge opportunity to do that, because it takes all sorts of stuff is coming up that could be very damaging if we just let it rip. But if we can contain it and allow that, that underneath there is some love there that is we want to heal the situation, and we can use some of these thoughts and these teachings to help us to do that, then the benefit at the end of the day to you will be a huge, that positive spiritual learning to sort of, I think it's very much like you're growing as a person through that, through learning to handle your emotional reactions in a more positive way, is so beneficial to you and to everybody around you at the end of the day.
Everything grows on.
Yeah.
That's it, out of shit, basically. Vegetables, food.
Yeah, true. Very true. That's a very good analogy. Yeah. Absolutely right. Yeah.
Just a point on the Dalai Lama's website. That verse, instead of using the term spiritual friend, uses the term precious teacher.
Yeah. It means the same thing. Spiritual friend here is meant in the sense of a teacher.
But that precious teacher. That
Correct.
Really
that's right. Yes.
And I think that sort of like what Ricky was saying about things growing or what have you.
Yeah.
You can learn a lot from these situations.
Yeah. This term spiritual friend is the translation of the word geshe.
Right.
Yeah. So it means, it means a teacher. It means a guru. Yeah.
I think there was a quote from, I think it was Pema Chodron, who said that everyone, including the people who drive you crazy, can be your teacher.
Especially the people who drive you crazy.
Hold your friends close and your enemies closer.
All right. Okay. Yeah, that's another good one. Yeah. We've got some good quotes coming here. Yeah. So this one about the enemy being your kindest teacher, this comes up again and again and again, doesn't it? And you know, again, it's like, and it. I think that the lamas mean it in a very, very straightforward and direct way. They really mean it. This is your real teacher, because you know the reasoning is because no one else can teach you patience other than somebody that is upsetting you, somebody that is hostile to you. So your guru can't really teach. They do their best sometimes, you know. they'll give you a bit of a challenge, but if you have love and respect for your guru and they give you a difficult, you know, something, it's not the same as somebody who really doesn't like you, who's really trying to do you down. To maintain equanimity, to maintain compassion towards them in that circumstance is much more difficult. And so that's why the lamas say, you know, this is your kindest teacher, your best teacher is the one who can teach you patience, who by being, you know, completely antagonistic and hostile, because anger is the greatest obstacle to the spiritual path. Anger can destroy all of our, you know, merit that we've built up so carefully over the years. A moment of anger can burn up all that merit. If we don't overcome anger, we can never become enlightened, and it's the most difficult thing to overcome. So if we do overcome it, then we're on, you know, we're on the way. So I think they mean it very literally. The enemy is our best teacher, our kindest teacher. And it takes a lot of practice and training to really internalize that and really feel that. But I think you can see it. You can see it with the Dalai Lama, when he talks about the Chinese. And not only the Dalai Lama, many of the lamas, you know, their attitude to the Chinese who did unbelievably dreadful things. You know, millions, apparently, it's not 1 million, it's maybe 2 million Tibetans who were killed. What they did to some of the monks just doesn't even bear describing. It's unbelievable atrocities were committed. And it's still going on. It's a little bit different now, but it's still, you know, quite dreadful. And yet, many of these great lamas, including these two actually, Geshe Rabten and Geshe Dagye, particularly spoke about it when they came out of Tibet, that they were, you know, kind of travelling through Tibet while all this was happening, while, you know, rape and pillage and dreadful things were happening, meditating on loving kindness and patience towards the Chinese who were doing it all the time. So,
can I just ask a quick point? I think in theory, I really like this paragraph.
Yeah.
In practice, I enormously struggle with it.
Of course.
Because it feels somewhat ludicrously aspirational, if I'm really frank.
Yeah.
So I think, well, who do we place great hope in?
Yeah.
Tends to be our parents or some faith leaders. And I really struggle. You know, you could take it to the extreme end. If a parent lets a child down in a pretty atrocious manner, is that the supreme spiritual friend? Where, I suppose there's part of me that kind of feels like, do we have no need? Do we have no expectation? Do we have no requirement? I wouldn't call an abused child looking at the parent, see that parent as a supreme spiritual friend. And there's countless examples where I can think, how does that really translate into life in the Western world?
No, thank you for that. I mean, that's a very good point, very good question. And so a couple of things about that. One is, yes, it is. I mean, you always say ludicrously aspirational. Yeah, it is way beyond what is possible for most of us at the moment. It is. And the point that is being made here is that we tend to sort of categorize as certain things that are within my range of possibilities and others which are outside of that. Like, I'm never going to win Wimbledon, you know. In this life, anyway. Maybe next life. But partly because you know, we are looking at it in the context of many lifetimes. But also because of the kind of philosophical view behind it. The mind can be developed limitlessly. So it's little by little, gradually, we're not trying to jump to that stage where we have perfect patience and loving kindness to everybody, but we're trying to just increase what we have now a little bit more, year by year, decade by decade, maybe lifetime by lifetime, until we get to that point. And it is the example of the great spiritual teachers of the past and the great spiritual teachers today. We can see examples where, even though that might seem almost impossible, yet there it is. I mean, I think I did mention this last week. Has anybody heard of Palden Gyatso? Anybody know who he is? He is still alive, yeah. He was a monk in Tibet who was arrested at the time of the uprising in 1959 in Lhasa, and people were put into concentrations. He was in concentration camps and prisons for 33 years, and he was repeatedly tortured. And he eventually escaped after 33 years. All of that time, he had maintained the determination to survive and to escape in order to tell the world about what was happening in Tibet. And I met him shortly after he escaped. He'd written a book about his experiences, which was published, and he was going around on a speaking tour talking about this. And he'd lost all of his teeth because he'd had an electric cattle prod thrust down his throat numerous times. And he had, when he escaped, he smuggled out of Tibet with him a number of the instruments of torture that were used on him. Amazing. Anyway, as I say, he said many times that he never lost compassion for the people that were torturing him. He never experienced anger towards them. And he stayed in my house, a wonderful, lovely man. 2 years later he came back and he was like, he'd just got a new set of teeth and he was absolutely radiant, smiling. And, this kind of extraordinary sort of wonderful energy was pouring out of him. He broke his arm and the doctors told him it was going to take him 6 months to heal, and it healed in 6 weeks. So clearly something, I guess, going through all of that had been an amazing sort of, developed some amazing sort of spiritual and physical powers. So when you meet somebody like that, you realise that these things, although they sound impossible, they're not. There are people who are really practicing like this. So this is the ultimate goal. We might not get there in 1 year or 5 years or even 10 years or even one lifetime, but that's the ultimate goal, is that kind of complete selflessness. And when you meet someone like that, I mean, as I say, the first time he just recently got out of Tibet, he looked absolutely very haggard and, worn down, beaten down, and he wasn't smiling. The next time he was just was a radiant, beautiful person. You could see, although he'd been subjected to so much suffering because he'd had a positive mental attitude throughout, the eventual result was just a tremendously happy person, completely at peace with everything. So living examples there are, quite a number of them.
Into the lad on a bus with his brother that killed my dad.
Oh yeah.
He got 5 years and he was out after 3.5, and this was about 3 years after he got out, and I hated him for a long time. And then I stopped hating him because it was consuming me.
Right.
And when I got on the bus and I saw him, I could have got off the bus. I didn't sit next to him. I sat at the back of the bus. I didn't say anything to him. I was angry, but I didn't do anything.
Yeah.
And it would have been very easy for me to want to attack him, because after he'd killed me dad, me and my brother were going to find out when he got out of prison where he was.
Yeah.
But I knew that if I did that, then I'd go to prison.
Yeah.
I wouldn't grow up with me 3 kids. So I had to make choices that were very difficult, because lots of people said, why didn't you do him when you saw him?
Yeah, sure.
But then there's living with that.
Yeah.
Because if I'd have hit him and hurt him, then I'd have had to face them consequences, and I'd have been no better than he was. So I don't love the guy, and I'd never buy him a drink, and I won't sit and have a chat with him. But going from hating somebody to being in the same 10 or 15 feet of him and sitting there and not running or not hurting him or not shouting. Very difficult.
Yes.
It can be done. And I'll bring the paper in next week with my dad on the front page so people know that, it's true. He was stabbed to death.
Mm.
So it is really hard.
I'm sure.
And I'm no Buddhist, and I don't know half the words, and I don't know the prayers in Tibetan.
Well, maybe that's the true Buddhism, Richard. What are you talking about?
The heart's a really powerful thing, and so is the mind.
Yeah.
So yeah, things, they do change.
So thank you very much for sharing that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I watched one of the programs with Desmond Tutu, and who led the Truth Commission in South Africa, and he went to Northern Ireland, and there were a sort of series of television programs with people who had perpetrated, these sort of murders, sectarian murders and things, and the families of the victims coming together and talking about why they'd done what they'd done, what their experience was. And it was amazing to see the healing that did take place through that. So it is quite unusual, but it's not unknown. It's very real. And thank you for bringing a real life example there, Richard. Yeah, often what you hear is what you said. That if I had not, to some degree or other, forgiven that person, I would be the one to suffer. I would have suffered for the rest of my life from being consumed by this hatred. And we can see, turning that around, actually, if you can go from that to having some kind of empathetic insight. Why did that person do that? What through his life, and it may have been something when he was 6 months old that was done to him, that planted the seed in him to be so negative. That could have happened to anybody, couldn't it? So I'm very fortunate that I wasn't born into the same circumstances as that person and end up like him. So it is very challenging, you're right. Very challenging. But the challenge comes from the nature of life, doesn't it? It doesn't come from some perverse idea of some Tibetan monks. It's like life is like that. Life throws up these challenges for us. And how do we relate to them? How do we learn to respond to those very difficult situations in a more positive way? And it's a very deep learning. It's not a small thing at all. So, yeah, that's quite a big one, isn't it? Verse 6. And then verse 7. It's going even further, isn't it? In brief, I shall offer benefit and bliss to all beings, both in this actual life and in the future continuum, and secretly I shall take upon myself all of the harms and sufferings of my mothers. Okay, so when it says my mothers, this is the idea that all sentient beings, because I've been reborn countless times in the past, at some point in all of those infinite previous lifetimes, every single living being who's here now was my mother in that past life. So this is what the Dalai Lama says, that the common people of Tibet didn't know very much about Buddhism. And they would know the phrase, the three jewels, but they wouldn't know what they were. But they all knew this phrase, mother sentient beings. And they thought of all, when they, even the animals, they would see them as, that yak was once my mother. So they have this very beautiful sort of loving attitude to animals. And supposedly all living beings. I'm not sure that the harmful spirits and things that are around. They think of them like that, and they don't always think of their own family members that way either. But but they know that they're supposed to. They know that if we have this thought whenever we meet anybody or any living being, that they were once my mother and they looked after me with kindness and raised me and so on. As I say, this is the basis of the other technique for developing the mind of enlightenment, bodhicitta, is to think of all sentient beings as having once been your mother. And remember, an important point, by the way, because this often comes up, this isn't so suitable for Westerners because we don't have such a good relationship with our parents, The important point is that the next point is to remember the kindness of the mother. Remember all of the things that your mother did for you, whatever kind of shortcomings she may have had as a mother. You wouldn't be here if she hadn't looked after you. So that remembering that kindness, remembering all the things that your mother did, usually, like for 99.9% of us, if we're honest about it and if we look and think, the gripes that we have with our mother are nothing compared to what she actually did to make our lives better, So that's in a way is a bit of an aside, just explaining what that last line where it says the harms and sufferings of my mother. So what this verse is saying, and this is what we did in the meditation last week, is there's we train ourselves in developing the wish to take away the sufferings of all sentient beings and give them all of our happiness. So this strange idea, it's very much at the heart of the mind training. And we can see how all the verses leading up to it have been like examples of that, really. So here it's taking it onto the cosmic scale. Everywhere sentient beings are suffering. We think about the suffering just in this world, just of the human beings who are in the minority. It's kind of, it's mind-boggling, isn't it? It's overwhelming. You even think about the amount of suffering, human suffering in this city. We normally don't connect with the reality, the magnitude of that, do we? The enormity of it. How many thousands upon thousands of people in this city are going through appalling stress because of debt. They're going through terrible marital problems and family problems. They're in unpleasant environments. They're in fear of, because their neighbourhood is suffering from crime. Think about all of those different types of suffering. People's health problems and the anxieties that come from that, the mental health problems, depression, hopelessness. That's just a tiny fragment of all the suffering that there is, isn't it? Think about the animals. How many? Does anybody know how many kind of livestock animals there are in this country? I mean, it's an awful lot more than the number of human beings, isn't it? I think people eat sort of several cows and sheep and quite a number of chickens every year, each person on average, and they're not having a good time. So to think about the totality of human suffering, the totality of suffering of all sentient beings, is almost beyond the power of our mind to do. And what this verse is saying, when you talk about being ludicrously aspirational. Sorry, what's your name again?
Michael.
Michael, I beg your pardon. Michael, yeah, thank you. This is even beyond that, isn't it? It's like we're going to take on all of that suffering and we're going to give all of our happiness to all of those sentient beings. It's beyond ludicrous. But there it is. And it's based on the simple premise that we can develop these qualities of compassion and concern for others without any limit. There's no natural reason why it should stop at 10 sentient beings or 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000. So a Buddha is able to have that heartfelt loving kindness and compassion towards infinite sentient beings. And that is, as I say, we can't grasp it with our imagination, but logically there's no reason why there should be a limit. And what what the teachers are saying, there isn't a limit. We find it hard to imagine the possibility of an enlightened being, a Buddha, being able to encompass the suffering of all sentient beings throughout the universe. But it doesn't follow that it's not true, just because we find it difficult to imagine. So that's the end point, the logical limit, if you like, of this idea of progressing gradually from where we are now, where we have a little bit of ability to extend loving kindness and compassion to others and bring benefit to others, if that is developed without limit. And I think I spoke about that earlier on, about, that I had this quite a strong experience of it in India, seeing the way that the Dalai Lama is building this extraordinary sort of vision that his positive influence is radiating throughout the world, throughout millions of people. And I began to see, it began to be some sense of a tangible reality to it, that here's someone who through lifetime after lifetime, as we know, he's the 14th Dalai Lama. In fact, his incarnations go back well before that. So he has been training as a bodhisattva for many, many lifetimes. And because of that, now he's able to manifest in the world in a way that brings really profound benefit to huge numbers of people, and maybe to other beings as well, for all we know. So although we find it difficult to grasp that possibility and think about it as something that we ourselves are aspiring to, it's simply like a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. That if we keep going, eventually that's where we'll end up to after that many lifetimes, So that can be, if we can sort of get our heads around it, can be a very, very encouraging thought, because it's very easy to be completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of this suffering and think, well, there's nothing I can do, there's nothing that can be done, we're all doomed. And as an environmentalist, I've been subject to that quite a lot, especially recently, I now find that I'm just veering more and more towards the spiritual practice side of things and finding it more and more difficult to engage with the political stuff, because, and especially after, I think having that experience of the Dalai Lama in India, seeing that although he is a political person in a way, but it all kind of, in a way that it all just grows naturally out of the spiritual practice. That's the whole centre of his being. That's what his kind of life is really all about. So the fact that he is a politician as well is just one aspect of that. That's an aside, but what I'm sort of trying to put into the space here is that if we see that vastness of that vision, we can feel very comfortable with our present limitations, actually, because we know that if we keep putting one foot in front of the other, that's where we'll end up. So we can, have that trust that we do our best. It may be not seem very much at the moment, but it's going to grow because it's on a sound foundation. If it wasn't, if there was something, flaky, questionable about the teachings themselves, then we might not have the reason to have that confidence. But the more that you investigate these teachings, the more that you will see that they are absolutely sound and valid, and they logically stand up to logical reasoning. And also you can see the example of the great teachers like the Dalai Lama and Lama Zopa. This is my view. You may have a different view, and that's fine, but that's how I see it. I think, over the years, I've just become more and more clear that these teachings are valid, absolutely valid. No matter that some of them may seem a little bit strange or a little bit kind of extreme, perhaps. But the more you investigate them, the more they stand up to investigation and reasoning. So this is the this is where it's all leading up to, this verse saying, ultimately what this practice is about is progressively training ourselves to have the aspiration to take suffering from others, to be willing to accept that suffering. Not that necessarily that's what's going to happen. If we practice this meditation of taking and giving, and we're developing a mind that would, if it were possible, we would wish to experience the suffering that others are experiencing so that they could be free of it. It doesn't mean that's actually what's going to happen. What happens is quite the opposite, that we through training our mind in that way, we experience more and more happiness, actually. So it might seem as though we failed. There's a nice story actually about one of these Kadampa Geshis. I think it was Geshe Potawa, actually. It was one of the Geshe Langri Tangpa's teacher, the teacher of the author of the 8 verses. As he was dying, his disciples were gathered round him, as they often do, and he's giving his sort of final instructions, and he's saying to them, I've failed. All my life I've prayed to be reborn in the hell realms, and now the Pure Land is appearing around me. It's a lovely statement. So they do. The Bodhisattvas, as Lama Zopa said, the Bodhisattvas pray to be reborn in the hell realms, because that's where their help is needed most. But usually that's not what happens. Because they pray to that, because they are willing to experience suffering on behalf of others, the karmic consequences that they are born in the Pure Land. I think actually there was some meaning to it. He did to some extent, he meant it, because of course a Buddha, fully enlightened being, is everywhere, so they are in the hell realms too. So maybe he was saying, I'm not completely fully enlightened yet. I don't know. One could speculate. Maybe it was just a teaching. But the point is, that there is this paradoxical element to this practice of taking and giving, exchanging self for others, that through this training in compassion, in concern for others, such that we would be willing to experience the suffering that they are experiencing so that they can be free of it, actually the karmic consequence is the opposite. We experience happiness. It doesn't mean that it makes their suffering worse. I mean, it won't do. It may make it better. But it's a difficult idea to kind of really take on board. But that's what, that's the message there. And as I say, the important thing is that we don't that we recognise that it's a gradual training. It's something we develop slowly over a period of time. So Shantideva says in the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, that at the moment I may not be able to give away my body, literally give up my life for the sake of another sentient being. But if I start and train my mind gradually to accept small sufferings, eventually I will develop that complete selflessness. And that will benefit me. The moment it doesn't feel like you, oh no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go there. Don't want to end up being as selfless as that. But it's not that it would harm us, It can never harm you.
David, can you explain what it means by taking on another person's suffering? Because we normally associate suffering with like a painful feeling. So we're obviously not taking on, making ourselves feel terrible, because then it hinders us in our lives. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you. Yes, try to clarify that a little bit. I mean, it might do. You might feel like there's somebody who's suffering, who's sick, who's suffering some kind of pain, and if you have real love and compassion for them, then, and this is not something that is unknown. Like for a mother, for instance, if their child was suffering some sickness and in a lot of pain, they might well think, I wish I could have that instead, and the child be free. And there's sometimes, that if that's a very strong, pure wish, that might even happen. It's a bit unusual, but it could happen, and then you could rejoice. You've actually taken their suffering. It is possible. And if someone has a strong, concentration, meditation practice, strong spiritual practice, and they have very powerful compassion, they can sometimes do it. For us, the main point is that we're training to develop that compassion. So usually it doesn't mean that, we then experience. But if we experience a physical suffering or something like that, still on a deeper level, we're gaining spiritual benefit. You see what I'm saying? It's like, yeah?
But just on a practical level, I guess, I've always I do understand what you're saying, but it's the compassion is a blissful mind, isn't it? As well as
Yeah, it is a blissful mind.
I guess I'm just trying to get my head around.
Yes, yeah, that's that's a very good point, Fiona. It's quite a subtle thing there. You might be experiencing what is normally classed as physical suffering. You've got pain. Yeah. Supposing you were successful, somebody's in pain, and you think, I want to take that pain from you, and you practice the meditation, and it works, and you get the pain, and they get better. So then you've got a physical pain, but you might be mentally quite blissful. Yeah. So it's not necessarily in a contradiction between the two. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes. Yeah. I guess I was referring to sort of. I tend to associate pain with mental pain. So
yeah, so that would be more difficult if somebody's kind of experiencing the deep depression, and you think, oh, I wish that it was me instead of you, which you might do. You might have that thought, and then you feel very depressed, and they're going away happy.
Yes,
then you are.
That's what we're trying to do here, is it?
I mean, that's a really interesting example, I think, and I can kind of imagine, because even there, like to some extent, depression is sort of a feeling. So you might have that feeling, the heavy feeling, but underneath it, you could still have that awareness that this is really something positive. Now that's more difficult, quite subtle at that point.
I think, David, that one, from my experience, is the more natural and easy one to happen. So if somebody close to you has got a mental affliction or a depression or because of something, and you've got that level of compassion for them, I'm only saying from people close to you.
Yeah.
You do absorb that, I think, more naturally, out of concern.
Yeah. I mean, you have the kind of empathic sadness. You share that. You kind of enter into their sadness, their depression. You feel sad for them.
There's the empathy, but I think sometimes it goes a bit further than that. I don't know. Difficult to explain. Very difficult to explain. More so than, say, the idea of taking a pain. If you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Mentally, you can get to that.
But there's a distinction we need to make there, Lindsay, because, I can feel sorry for someone and be upset about the fact that they're feeling depressed. Now, that doesn't necessarily help them.
No, I know what you mean.
Yeah? What we're talking about here is actually through the power of your meditation, you've taken the depression from them and taken it upon yourself. Now, that I would say that is possible. It's possible. It's very subtle there. I mean, because to distinguish between what exactly is... Because depression is in a way is a physical condition often. It's like, it's
sometimes in the
difficult.
process of
it's a bit of both.
helping them to take it away, you do take it on, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, yeah, that's true. I mean, I suppose, if you, for instance, out of a beneficial motivation, someone goes into the field of mental health as a mental health worker, then they are probably exposing themselves to a lot of kind of difficult energies and situations that are around them. They might be, the stress might cause them to go through quite a lot of difficult emotions and experiences.
That's what I'm meaning.
Yeah.
Trying to say, but I'm not on that level, maybe.
Yeah. So that would be a very practical example, actually. That somebody needs to, in order for those people to get better, somebody needs to be willing to go into those situations where it's not comfortable and where it can be quite stressful. And people in those professions often experience a lot of stress, and sometimes they have to take, leave of absence because it's getting too much. And that needn't be because there's anything unskillful about their motivation or their understanding of the situation. It just is very difficult for most people. So that would be an example of literally taking on, someone's suffering.
Or could it be, if you have a lot of love and compassion for somebody that's suffering, just your aspiration and intention and your love for them is enough to kind of, you can't actually physically take it away.
Doing this meditation, if there's somebody you have a strong karmic connection with, like a family member or somebody that's close to you, often my experience is that it does have an effect. They not have to be in the same room. You can do it, and you find mysteriously, something's happened. I mean, that's just.
I'm just wondering actually about the effect it would have on our own minds, though, by doing that. The idea of we're not actually making ourselves feel awful, because that's not beneficial to
you. Well, you might temporarily experience some suffering, but the eventual result is going to be positive. I think an example that I was mentioning the other night. Serkong Rinpoche, who was one of the tutors of the Dalai Lama, he's the Dalai Lama's Kalachakra master. He died in 1984, and shortly before he died, he was speaking to some of his students and saying that there were some karmic obstacles to the life of the Dalai Lama at this time. And he was saying that it would be very good if some people were to do this practice of taking on, for His Holiness. That it would be a good thing if people did that practice. Shortly afterwards, he died. And there were some indications that made it quite clear that's what he'd done. He'd taken on that karmic problem that the Dalai Lama had and given his life for the sake of, so that the Dalai Lama's life would be secure. And there's several other High Lamas that died in the same year. And some people said that maybe they all did it. So at that level, at that level. Now, nobody's saying we should try and do that.
No, I guess that's what my question is around, is we're, at our level.
But I mean, it might be, that on a kind of more sort of more modest scale, that we do experience some suffering, and that would be good. It doesn't. Experiencing suffering isn't necessarily at all a bad thing from a spiritual point of view.
Can it not be taken down to something so small, like listening to somebody's problem? So somebody's suffering with a problem, and by listening to them, you take a bit of that on.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think try to think of it in really simple things rather than extreme things.
I think what I do want to make very clear is it's not necessarily the case that if you're practicing taking and giving that you will experience any suffering. Not necessarily. It can be effective both for your own mind and for the other person and not involve you.
Yes, I guess
it might do or it might not. That's not really the essence of it, because the fact that we experience some suffering is not a negative.
No, I guess my point is that by the process of actually generating the mind of compassion and love, you're purifying your own kind of obstacles.
Sure.
So you're actually making yourself, your own life, purer and lighter and more blissful and happier.
Absolutely.
So, and I've forgotten what the original definition was.
Well, I think the point that you're making was, that it's not that we don't want to be experiencing suffering because it's not spiritually beneficial, but that's quite a subtle one. Because sometimes it is. I mean, even just going on retreat, and I was on a retreat, and we were working extremely hard. We were meditating like 10, 12 hours a day, and I had terrible diarrhea and an awful cold. I was going through a lot of suffering, and great, that was it. Often we need to experience this suffering to make progress on the spiritual path. It's not that suffering's a bad thing all the time. It isn't.
Perhaps happiness is defined by pain. Because you need to experience one.
That's true.
Experience the other.
Yeah. We'll talk a bit more about this next week because it's very relevant. The sort of how do we relate to our own experiences of suffering is very important here. And it's true that we're not kind of, it's possible people sometimes can get into a state of mind where they're really just sort of masochistically inflicting suffering on themselves, and that can be very mistaken. But there's a different way of relating to it, where to be accepting suffering is very positive and important on the spiritual path. So I think to distinguish between those two things is quite important and quite subtle. So thank you for bringing it up, because that's it's an important point. We'll talk more about that next week. Thank you.
So would this be similar to suffering of change, like reversed? It could look.
Yes, it could be. It could be that this. We're experiencing some temporary suffering for the sake of a greater spiritual benefit further down the line. Yeah, I mean, that's quite a good way of explaining it. Yes, thank you. Did you want to say something, Paul?
Just, we're talking about Tonglen, right?
Yes.
So, is there not an element of...
Tonglen is taking and giving, by the way, that's meditation.
Self-cherishing, that the suffering that you're taking on is cancelling out your own self-cherishing. The taking in the blackness. No. That's not self-cherishing. I mean, of course, we're doing it in order to benefit ourselves as well as others. But the fact that we're doing something to benefit, if I'm doing something to benefit myself, is not necessarily self-cherishing. No.
Right?
What I mean is the taking on the suffering helps to cancel out your own self-cherishing.
Correct.
Yeah, so your own, like you're taking in I always imagine it as like this is this blackness coming in, and there's this blackness inside you, and the blackness becomes white, and then that comes.
Absolutely right. Yes, that's correct. And
I always think that blackness is self-cherishing.
Yes, right. Yes. So we're using that suffering to. As a kind of force to counteract our self-cherishing. I'll talk more about it next time. I probably need to stop there. One more question.
I remember I was listening to another Lama explaining this, and he was saying if you're doing this meditation, it's difficult to do it.
Yeah.
You can imagine your future self as among the others.
Right. Okay.
Taking your future suffering and offering this. You're saying if you find it difficult, you can do it this way.
Okay, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that particular variation. We will continue. I mean, we've got a lot of time to spend with this, because one thing about these, unlike the Lamrim, there's lots of different topics in the Lamrim, but in the mind training, it's already, this is the main thing, so we can explore it quite in some depth over the time that we've got. But thank you for that question.